Hey, listening squirrels! Let's go ahead and read chapter 12 of The Murder Is It at the Vicarage? I was summoned to the study when Lawrence Redding arrived. He looked haggard and I thought suspicious. Colonel Melchett greeted him with something approaching cordiality. "We want to ask you a few questions here on the spot," he said. Lawrence sneered slightly. "Isn't that a French idea, reconstruction of the crime?" "My dear boy," said Colonel Melchett, "don't take that tone with us. Are you aware that someone else has also confessed to committing the crime which you pretend to have committed?" The effect of these words... Oops. Dropping stuff. The effect of these words on Lawrence was painful and immediate. "Someone else," he stammered. "Who?" "Mrs. Prothero," said Colonel Melchett, watching him. "Absurd. She never did it. She couldn't have. It's impossible." Melchett interrupted him. "Strangely enough, we did not believe her story. Neither, I may say, do we believe yours. Dr. Haydock says positively that the murder could not have been committed at the time you say it was." "Dr. Haydock says that?" "Yes, so you see, you are cleared whether you like it or not, and now we want you to help us to tell us exactly what occurred." Lawrence still hesitated. "You're not deceiving me about Mrs. Prothero? You don't really suspect her?" "On my word of honor," said Colonel Melchett. Lawrence drew a deep breath. "I've been a fool," he said, "an absolute fool. How could I have thought for 1 minute that she did it?" "Suppose you tell us all about it," suggested the chief constable. "There's not much to tell. I met Mrs. Prothero that afternoon." He paused. "We know all about that," said Melchett. "You may think that your feeling for Mrs. Prothero and hers for you was a dead secret, but in reality it was known and commented upon. In any case, everything is bound to come out now." "Very well, then, I expect you are right. I had promised the vicar here," he glanced at me, to go right away. "I met Mrs. Prothero that evening in the studio at 6:15. I told her of what I had decided. She, too, agreed that it was the only thing to do. We said goodbye to each other. We left the studio, and almost at once Dr. Stone joined us. Anne managed to seem marvelously natural. I couldn't do it. I went off with Stone to the Blue Boar and had a drink. Then I thought I'd go home, and when I got to the corner of this road, I changed my mind and decided to come along and see the vicar. I felt I wanted someone to talk to about the matter. At the door, the maid told me the vicar was out, but would be in shortly, but that Colonel Prothero was in the study waiting for him. Well, I didn't like to go away again. Looked as though I were shirking meeting him, so I said I'd wait too and went into the study." He stopped. "Well," said Colonel Melchett, "Prothero was sitting at the writing table just as you found him. I went up to him, touched him. He was dead. Then I looked down and saw the pistol lying on the floor beside him. I picked it up and at once saw that it was my pistol. That gave me a turn. My pistol! And then straight away I leaped to one conclusion. Anne must have bagged my pistol sometime or other, meaning it for herself if she couldn't bear things any longer. Perhaps she had it with her today. After we parted in the village, she must have come back here and... Oh, I suppose I was mad to think of it, but that's what I thought. I slipped the pistol in my pocket and came away. Just outside the vicarage gate, I met the vicar. He said something nice and normal about seeing Prothero. Suddenly I had a wild desire to laugh. His manner was so ordinary and everyday, and there I was, all strung up. I remember shouting out something absurd and seeing his face change. I was nearly off my head, I believe. I went walking. At last I couldn't bear it any longer. If Anne had done this ghastly thing, I was at least morally responsible. I went and gave myself up." There was a silence when he had finished. Then the colonel said in a businesslike voice, I would like to ask just one or two questions. First, did you touch or move the body in any way? No, I didn't touch it at all. I thought he said he did. One could see he was dead without touching him. Did you notice a note lying on the blotter half concealed by his body? No. Did you interfere in any way with the clock? I never touched the clock. I seem to remember a clock lying overturned on the table, but I never touched it. Now as to this pistol of yours, when did you last see it? Lawrence Redding reflected. It's hard to say exactly. Where do you keep it? Oh, in a litter of odds and ends in the sitting room in my cottage, on one of the shelves of the bookcase. You left it lying about carelessly? Yes, I really didn't think about it. It was just there. So that anybody who came to your cottage could have seen it? Yes. And you don't remember when you last saw it? Lawrence drew his brows together in a frown of recollection. I'm almost sure it was there the day before yesterday. I remember pushing it aside to get an old pipe. I think it was the day before yesterday, but it may have been the day before that. Who's been to your cottage lately? Oh, crowds of people. Someone is always drifting in and out. I had a sort of tea party the day before yesterday. Lettuce Prothero, Dennis, and all their crowd, and then one or another of the old pussies come in now and again. Do you lock the cottage up when you go out? No, why on earth should I? I've nothing to steal, and no one does lock their house up around here. Who looks after your wants there? And old Mrs. Archer comes in every morning to do for me, as it's called. Do you think she would remember when the pistol was there last? I don't know, she might, but I don't fancy conscientious dusting is her strong point. It comes to this, that almost anyone might have taken that pistol. Seems so, yes. The door opened and Dr. Haydock came in with Ann Prothero. She started at seeing Lawrence. He, on his part, made a tentative step towards her. Forgive me, Ann, he said. It was abominable of me to think what I did. She faltered, then looked appealingly at Colonel Melchett. Is it true what Dr. Haydock told me? That Mr. Redding is cleared of suspicion? Yes. And now what about this story of yours, Mrs. Prothero, eh? What about that? She smiled rather shamefully. I suppose you think it shamefacedly. Suppose you think it dreadful of me? Well, shall we say very foolish, but that's all over. What I want now, Mrs. Prothero, is the truth, the absolute truth. She nodded gravely. I will tell you. I suppose you know about everything. Yes. I was to meet Lawrence, Mr. Redding, that evening at the studio at 6:15. My husband and I drove into the village together. I had some shopping to do. As we parted, he mentioned casually that he was going to see the vicar. I couldn't get word to Lawrence, and I was rather uneasy. It was awkward meeting him in the vicarage garden whilst my husband was at the vicarage. Her cheeks burned as she said this. It was not a pleasant moment for her. I reflected that perhaps my husband would not stay very long. To find this out, I came along the back lane and into the garden. I hoped no one would see me, but of course old Miss Marple had to be in her garden. She stopped me and we said a few words, and I explained I was going to call for my husband. I felt I had to say something. I don't know whether she believed me or not. She looked rather funny. When I left her, I went straight across to the vicarage, round the corner of the house to the study window. I crept up to it very softly, expecting to hear the sound of voices. Sorry, touched it and it went flying. Hear voices, but to my surprise there were none. I just glanced in, saw the room was empty, and hurried across the lawn down to the studio where Lawrence joined me almost at once. You say the room was empty, Miss Prothero? Yes, my husband was not there. Extraordinary. You mean, ma'am, that you didn't see him, said the inspector. No, I didn't see him. Inspector Slack whispered to the chief constable, who nodded. "Do you mind, Mrs. Prothero, just showing us exactly what you did?" "Not at all." She rose. Inspector Slash pushed open the window for her, and she stepped out on the terrace and round the house to the left. Inspector Slack beckoned to me imperiously to go and sit at the writing table. Somehow I didn't much like doing it. It gave me an uncomfortable feeling, but of course I complied. Presently I heard footsteps outside. They paused for a minute, then retreated. Inspector Slack indicated to me that I could return to the other side of the room. Mrs. Prothero re-entered through the window. "Is that exactly how it was?" asked Colonel Melchett. "I think exactly." "Then can you tell us, Mrs. Prothero, just exactly where the vicar was in the room when you looked in?" asked Inspector Slack. "The vicar? No, I'm afraid I can't. I didn't see him." Inspector Slack nodded. "That's how you didn't see your husband. He was round the corner at the writing desk." "Oh," she paused. Suddenly her eyes grew round with horror. "It wasn't there that—" "Yes, Mrs. Prothero, it was while he was sitting there." "Oh," she quivered. He went on with his questions. "Did you know, Mrs. Prothero, that Mr. Redding had a pistol?" "Yes, he told me so once." "Did you ever have that pistol in your possession?" She shook her head. "No." "Do you know where he kept it?" "I'm not sure. I think. Yes, I've seen it on a shelf in his cottage." "Didn't you keep it there, Lawrence?" "When was the last time you were at the cottage, Mrs. Prothero?" "Oh, about 3 weeks ago. My husband and I had tea there with him." "And you had not been there since?" "No, I never went there. You see, it would probably cause a lot of talk in the village." "Doubtless," said Colonel Melchett dryly. Where were you in the habit of seeing Mr. Redding, if I may ask?" "He used to come up to the hall. He was painting lettuce." Such a crazy name. We often met in the woods afterwards." Colonel Melchett nodded. "Isn't that enough?" Her voice was suddenly broken. "It's so awful having to tell you all these things, and there wasn't anything wrong about it." "There wasn't, indeed there wasn't. We were just friends. We couldn't help caring for each other." She looked pleadingly at Dr. Haydock, and that soft-hearted man stepped forward. "I really think, Melchett," he said, "that Mrs. Prothero has had enough. She's had a great shock in more ways than one." The chief constable nodded. "There's really nothing more I want to ask you, Mrs. Prothero," he said. "Thank you for answering my questions so frankly." Then I may go?" "Is your wife in?" asked Haydock. "I think Mrs. Prothero would like to see her." "Yes," I said, "Griselda is in. You'll find her in the drawing room." She and Haydock left the room together, and Lawrence Redding with them. Colonel Melchett had pursed up his lips and was playing with the paper knife. Slack was looking at the note. It was then that I mentioned... Oh, come on. It was then that I mentioned Miss Marple's theory. Slack looked closely at it. "My word," he said, "I believe the old lady's right. Look here, sir, don't you see? These figures are written in different ink. That date was written with a fountain pen, or I'll eat my boots." We were all rather excited. "You've examined the note for fingerprints, of course," said Chief Constable. "What do you think, Colonel?" "No fingerprints on the note at all. Fingerprints on the pistol, those of Mr. Lawrence Redding. They have been some others once before he went fooling around with it and carrying it around in his pocket, but there's nothing clear enough to get hold of now." "At first the case looked very black against Mrs. Prothero," said the colonel thoughtfully. "Much blacker than against young Redding. There was that old woman, Marple's, evidence that she didn't have the pistol with her. But these elderly ladies are often mistaken. I was silent, but I did not agree with him. I was quite sure that Anne Prothero had had no pistol with her since Miss Marple had said so. Miss Marple is not the type of elderly lady who makes mistakes. She's got an uncanny knack of being always right. What did get me was that nobody heard the shot. If it was fired then, somebody must have heard it, wherever they thought it came from. Slack, you'd better have a word with the maid. Inspector Slack moved with alacrity towards the door. I shouldn't ask her if she heard a shot in the house, I said, because if you do, she'll deny it. Call it a shot in the wood. That's the only kind of shot she'll admit to hearing. I know how to manage them, said Inspector Slack, and disappeared. Miss Marple says she heard a shot later, said Colonel Melchett thoughtfully. We must see if she can fix the time at all precisely. Of course, it may be a stray shot that had nothing to do with the case. It may be, of course, I agreed. The colonel took a turn or two up and down the room. Do you know, Clement, he said suddenly, I've got a feeling that this is going to turn out a much more intricate and difficult business than any of us think. Dash it all, there's something behind it, he snorted. Something we don't know about. We're only beginning, Clement. Mark my words, we're only beginning. All these things, the clock, the note, the pistol, they don't make sense as they stand. I shook my head. They certainly didn't. But I'm going to get to the bottom of it. No calling in of Scotland Yard. Slack's a smart man. He's a very smart man. He's a kind of ferret. He'll nose his way through to the trash. He's done several very good things already, and this case will be his chef d'oeuvre or something like that. I'm not sure. Some men would call in Scotland Yard. I shan't. We'll get to the bottom of this here in Downshire. I hope so, I'm sure, I said. I tried to make my voice enthusiastic, but I'd already taken such a dislike to Inspector Slack that the prospect of his success failed to appeal to me. A successful Slack would, I thought, be even more odious than a baffled one. Who has the house next door? Asked the colonel suddenly. You mean at the end of the road? Mrs. Price Ridley. We'll go along to her after Slack has finished with your maid. She might just possibly have heard something. She isn't deaf or anything, is she? I should say her hearing is remarkably keen. I'm going by the amount of scandal she has started by just happening to overhear accidentally. That's the kind of woman we want. Oh, here's Slack. The inspector had the air of one emerging from a severe tussle. Whew, he said. That's a tartar you got, sir. Mary is essentially a girl of strong character, I replied. Doesn't like the police, he said. I cautioned her, did what I could to put the fear of the law into her, but no good. She stood right up to me. Spirited, I said, feeling more kindly towards Mary. Oops, don't it? But I pinned her down all right. She heard one shot, and one shot only, and it was a good long time after Colonel Prothero came. I couldn't get her to name a time, but we fixed it at last by means of the fish. The fish was late, and she blew the boy up when he... The fish was late, and she blew the boy up when he came, and he said it was barely 6:30 anyway, and it was just after that she heard the shot. Of course, that's not accurate, so to speak, but it gives us an idea. Said Melchett. I don't think Mrs. Prothero's in this after all, said Slack with a note of regret in his voice. She wouldn't have had time to begin with, and then women never like fiddling about with firearms. Arsenic's more in their line. No, I don't think she did it. It's a pity, he sighed. Melchett explained that he was going round to Mrs. Price Ridley's, and Slack approved. May I come with you? I asked. I'm getting interested. I was given permission, and we set forth. A loud "Hee" greeted us as we emerged from the vicarage gate, and my nephew Dennis came running up the road from the village to join us. "Look here," he said to the inspector. "What about the footprint I told you about?" "Gardeners," said Inspector Slack laconically. "You don't think it might be someone else wearing the gardener's boots?" "No, I don't," said Inspector Slack in a discouraging way. It would take more than that to discourage Dennis, however. He held out a couple of burnt matches. "I found these by the vicarage gate." "Thank you," said Slack, and put them in his pocket. Matters appeared now to have reached a deadlock. "You're not arresting Uncle Lynn, are you?" inquired Dennis facetiously. "Why should I?" inquired Slack. "There's a lot of evidence against him," declared Dennis. "You ask Mary. Only the day before the murder he was wishing Colonel Prothero out of the world, weren't you, Uncle Lynn?" I began. Inspector Slack turned a slow, suspicious stare upon me, and I felt hot all over. Dennis is exceedingly tiresome. He ought to realize that a policeman seldom has a sense of humor. "Don't be absurd, Dennis," I said irritably. The innocent child opened his eyes in a stare of surprise. "I say it's only a joke," he said. "I say it's only a joke. Uncle Lynn just said that anyone who murdered Colonel Prothero would be doing the world a service." "Ah," said Inspector Slack, "that explains something the maid said." "Servants very seldom have any sense of humor either." I cursed Dennis heartily in my mind for bringing the matter up. That and the clock together will make the inspector suspicious of me for life. "Come on, Clement," said Colonel Melchett. "Where are you going?" "Can I come too?" asked Dennis. "No, you can't," I snapped. We left him looking after us with a hurt expression. We went up to the neat front door of Mrs. Price Ridley's house, and the inspector knocked and rang in what I can only describe as an official manner. A pretty parlor maid answered the bell. "Mrs. Price Ridley in?" inquired Melchett. "No, sir." The maid paused and added, "She's just gone down to the police station." This was a totally unexpected development. As we retraced our steps, Melchett caught me by the arm and murmured, "If she's going to confess to the crime too, I really shall go off my head." And that's it. So, next time, which hopefully will be tomorrow, will be chapter 13. Have a wonderful, creative night. Kelly should be on, if you're seeing this around 6:49 as I comment this on Sunday night. Excuse me. And I'm going to go over there and hopefully not fall asleep. Love y'all. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.